for the next hour or so, we're going to be talking about the employee handbook. So let's get started. If you have any questions, please feel free to hold them, and we can discuss them at the end of this part of the presentation. So we're going to begin with a scenario. Your organization has begun planning to update its strategic and business objectives, its organizational structure, and workforce processes. And many organizations are just beginning to do that now, planning for 2019. And as you're doing this planning, one of the things you notice is that there's increasing competition that requires an emphasis on talent management and positive employee relations. So with the unemployment rate low, and many employers are now looking for talent. While they prefer top talent, often they have to settle perhaps for something a little bit less than the top. But they're looking for talent, and that requires then that they not only think about hiring, but what does it mean to employ these people? What kind of working relationship will you have with these new employees? So that becomes something then that as part of the planning activity your organization may already be doing, or it will start to do fairly soon. In addition, you'll notice that there's a number of issues that are key to perhaps this coming year. And of course, one is sexual harassment. It's been in the news since November last year. It remains in the news. There's articles, it appears at least once a week on sexual harassment. And organizations are increasingly looking at what they need to do to address this issue. Is their handbook, is the procedures they discuss in their handbook sufficient? Do they need to take the additional action? So this is something that's now specific to your handbook, but more broadly, how are you going to address these issues? And how do you get your employees and your supervisors to understand the importance and the implications for your organization? We also see that as part of this process, part of this hiring process and recruiting process, that the workforce itself has changed. Many current employees, many people attached to the labor market are beginning to retire. And that means you're going to be looking for new employees, particularly millennials. And that's going to create both new opportunities and new issues for your organization to address. And of course, one of the places you'll be addressing these issues is in your employee handbook. So with all these issues coming up and you're thinking about these, it's now time to at least prepare for what happens with the handbook. So as we think about the employee handbook, let's start with a mission. What are we looking for in the employee handbook? Well, as the embodiment of your organization's values and culture, your handbook should do a couple of things. It should provide an indication of the tone at the top. Now, for those of you who are perhaps independent auditors, you'll be familiar with this. This is a phrase from the Institute of Internal Auditors, and it recognizes that management needs to play a role, a very important role, and needs to create and set the tone at the top, what the organization is trying to do, what its mission statement is. And so this increasingly now is something we're seeing in the employee handbook, where it's not enough to just say, here's your employee handbook. Senior management needs to communicate important things about the organization and what employees can expect from both the organization and management. Secondly, it helps choreograph day-to-day employee activities and interactions. So part of the handbook then is providing an understanding for employees about what happens during the day, how they relate with people, what your expectations are of the employees, what they can expect from you. So this is an important part then of the employee handbook. And it also plays a valuable role in demonstrating your organization's commitment to a culture of compliance. So probably some of you remember 10 years ago when we had the last recession, federal laws were passed to address this issue. And one of the things that was passed, it's now required of publicly traded companies, is this culture of compliance, this ethics that organizations should have communicated it to their employees. And of course, this becomes an important role in addition to the employee handbook. So with all these issues then, we see that your handbook formalizes these expectations. That is, it describes what your organization expects from your employees, but additionally, it tells your employees what they should expect from you. So as we move forward, this is something to think about as you design your employee handbook. So let's look at the positive and negatives of this, what we refer to as the employee handbook. So employee handbooks are, in effect, a double-edged sword. Handbooks that are aligned with strategic and business objectives, that are properly drafted and effectively implemented, enhance the employment brand, play a key role in the recruitment and retention process, and enhance employee relations, employee morale, and productivity. So some of the key features then of having a positive employee handbook create then this environment that we can both attract and keep employees. It also contributes to a uniform and consistent application, interpretation, and enforcement of organizational policies and rules. So your organization has these policies and rules that's developed. Some have been around for a long time, some are relatively new, and you need a way of communicating this with to your employees. And they need a way of understanding what these rules and regulations are. And so the handbook plays an important role in that activity. It also protects the organization against claims of improper employee supervisory conduct. So we have this workplace where we have individuals doing, to some extent, their own thing, and we need to at least gain some understanding and perhaps some control of what that is that they're doing. And the handbook plays an important role in communicating the key issues, things that you're looking for from your employees and perhaps your supervisor in their relationship with each other. It also reduces the organization's exposure to employment-related liabilities. So one of the things that an ongoing process that we're involved with is employment practice liability insurance. And so one of the things that we see from EPLI carriers, insurance carriers, is this understanding of the role that employee handbooks play. And if you have employment practice liability insurance, your insurer has probably asked for a copy of your employee handbook so they can gain an understanding of what's important. Now, many may have recommended some additional commentary, some additional thoughts on what they'd like to see in your employee handbook, but it's an important part of the process because it's from your employee handbook that your exposure begins to form. So something we're going to be talking about through the session today. Unfortunately, though, if your handbook is misaligned, if it's improperly drafted, or it's ineffectively implemented, it has some negative consequences. First, it undermines your employment brand. So, again, we're talking about today's marketplace. We're talking about attracting and keeping employees. The handbook at best should be neutral, and probably better it would be positive, but you don't want it negative. You want employees saying, well, this company doesn't match what I'm looking for based on what's in the employee handbook. So something to consider. It also can mislead employees about what's important and misdirect employees about what action they take. So you want to set the stage. You want to say, here's what's important to us. Here's what's important that should be important to you. Here's your actions that you should take. And if we don't fully describe the issue, here's the type of thought process the handbook is describing that you should take, employees, in responding. And if you don't do that, or if you mislead employees, you're going to get the wrong results. So an important feature then of employee handbooks is providing them with this direction. It also then reduces employee commitment and engagement. So employees look at this handbook. They get it certainly when they get hired. And it used to be the employees got the handbook, they'd go home, put it in their drawer, and never look at it again. Increasingly, we find that employees, particularly millennials, are now spending time looking at the handbook. As a matter of fact, for many of my clients, they're now actually responding to applicants' requests, millennials' requests for a copy of the handbook before the millennials make a commitment to come to work. They want to know more about the company that they're going to work for. Of course, they're not going to be staying the same amount of time as previous generation, but that's the commitment they're looking for. And so your work rules, your commitment to key issues then is now going to be open to individuals. And if it's not the right thing, first of all, you may not hire them, but even if you do, you're not going to get the commitment and engagement that you're looking for. So employee handbooks now are playing this wider role than many have seen it play in the past. It also increases the risk of employment-related claims and lawsuits and the possibility of systemic violations. Increasingly now, when an employee is separated or employees think about a claim, they'll go to their plaintiff's attorney, and one of the things that the plaintiff's attorney will ask for is a copy of the employee handbook. In some cases, the employee has lost the handbook and asks you for another copy. In some cases, they share their handbook with their plaintiff's attorney. And so your work rules, the relationship that you have with your employees now gets exposure. Sometimes this exposure is negative. So things to think about are how you write and distribute your employee handbook. And it also increases your organization's vulnerability to third-party intervention. So with all this activity now, you can understand that plaintiffs' attorneys, maybe the governmental agencies, the EEOC, the OSCCP, are now having showing more interest in looking and reviewing the employee handbook. So with as we look then at the opportunities and liabilities from handbooks, what we see then is employee handbooks provide organizations with, first of all, the ability to enhance the value of human capital. So in many organizations now, the key issue for the organization is the value created by their human capital. That's become the most important issue for them. And so the handbook can both describe it and actually enhance the value that you get from your human capital. Additionally, it can help make the organization more competitive. For most organizations now, they're in a competitive work environment, not just from local competition or regional competition or competition in the same state or perhaps across the country, but perhaps now internationally. And so they need to keep their employees, first of all, but need to keep them working in a positive environment. And so this plays the organization's handbook can play an important role in helping them achieve this competitiveness. Third, it also improves individual and organizational performance. So by telling employees what's expected of them, by showing them what you're going to respond to, what's going to be expected of you, this is going to have both an positive individual and organizational performance review result that you need. It also then improves human capital risk profile. When we talk about human capital, increasingly now we talk about human capital risk. And so risk is a very important key issue for senior management, one they address increasingly at the senior level. And of course, it's more than just a risk from a lawsuit. It's actually managing your employees, your workforce to get positive results. And so the handbook can play an important role in helping improve this risk profile. And of course, the final major thing is that it helps achieve business objectives and strategic objectives. And perhaps for many organizations, that this should be number one. As you develop your strategic objectives, as you do your strategic plan, as you look at your business objectives, human capital becomes an increasingly important role in that. And so managing that human capital requires some key issues. One is then having an employee handbook that does that. Unfortunately, though, and conversely, if the handbook doesn't achieve these goals, then it can impede the achievement of business objectives. So you have your business objectives, and then some of these objectives don't get fulfilled, don't get satisfied. And an important reason for that is you haven't gained employees' commitment to do this. So it can be a key issue. It also can increase employment-related liabilities. So we talked about some of those liabilities, but if you look at many of the lawsuits that are triggered against employers, typically then the plaintiff's attorney, the plaintiff himself or him or herself, will use the employee handbook. We'll look at the employee handbook and say, here's what they said. Here's what they didn't do. This created liability. This created negligence on the employer's part, and that's why I'm suing. And so that's part of the argument, one you have to be aware of. And so you want to make sure then that your employee handbook and what you're doing are in coordination with each other. And then it can also reduce managerial prerogatives by making promises or commitments to certain procedural safeguards that the organization did not intend to make. And so often during the hiring process, you have managers and supervisors in the hiring process. They have a key individual that they want to hire, and sometimes the employees say, well, how do you do this? Or can I get this vacation? Or can I take time off to do this? And the supervisor manager may understand that this is the key issue for this individual and make this commitment. Well, sure, we let people take time off to attend these types of things anyway, so we can do that. Maybe the organization does, but perhaps it didn't, and it doesn't. And so to the extent then that managerial prerogatives are creating false impressions of what your organization does, and that run counter to the employee handbook, or perhaps speak to issues that aren't addressed in your employee handbook, that's going to create potential problems for your organization in the future. And so you're better off understanding those and diagnosing these issues before they happen. So as we look then as handbooks have changed over time, we see that the purpose and value of employee handbooks are changing. Well, that's certainly true. The number of customers and stakeholders is growing. So as we think of employee handbooks, we typically think of, okay, we have this employee handbook. It's something we distribute to employees when they get hired, and that's it. And occasionally, in some cases, maybe years later, we may update it, but that's the relationship between us, the employees, and our handbook. But that's changing. It's changing very quickly. There's now the expectation, not only by employees, but by applicants, by other third parties, about what the employee handbook is doing, what commitments are being made, and so you need to think about that. And as we'll see, there's a growing list of individuals who are now looking at your handbook, looking for the message that you're trying to send. And it's an important message, so we need to be aware of that. We also see that the size and complexity of individuals, of your stakeholders, particularly employees, is expanding. As we talked about earlier, we've had millennials coming in now, replacing workers that we've had for a long time. Their expectations are different. What they look at is different. And so, if you're using the same employee handbook with the same workforce, an expanding workforce, a different workforce, you're going to run into problems. So this is something you need to think about. We also see the development process becoming more dynamic and more inclusive. So one of the things that we recommend when we design a handbook for an employer, as a matter of fact, I'm working on a couple right now, is that we have a number of meetings of the development team, but then we often, as we're approaching the final edition, we hold focus groups. We call a couple of employees in and show them the handbook and let them respond. Is it positive? Is it negative? Does it meet the issues that they consider important? And often we find that there are issues that they'd like addressed, the things that they run into that are not being addressed in the employee handbook. So that can become a dynamic feature then in the way handbooks are designed that many employers haven't done in the past. And of course, then with all this activity, perhaps some of the normal activity going on, the National Labor Relations Board issued its new regulations. Now, 3 years ago, the National Labor Relations Board issued its document on employee handbooks and held employers specifically liable for issues addressed in the handbook. Well, we have a new president, we have a new board, a new labor relations board, and so we see new regulations being passed and directed. So the NLRB has established a new standard that focuses on the balance between the rule's negative impact on employees' ability to exercise their Section 7 rights and the rules connected to the employer's right to maintain discipline and productivity in their workplace. This is a quote from the National Labor Relations Board. Now, just as a note, many will say, wait a minute, National Labor Relations Board, that deals with unions. We don't have unions, and it's now down to between 6 and 8% of the whole workforce has unions. So with that, then, we don't have to worry about this. Well, one of the things, if you look at the National Labor Relations Act, you see that parts of this apply to both union and non-union workers. And so you do have to be aware of this, whether or not you have a union workforce, because it's an important issue. And the previous National Labor Relations Board made it clear that they were going to hold employers with non-union workers to this standard. So this is, to some extent, a continuation of what goes back to the 1930s about the relationship between the National Labor Relations Act and all employers, not just unionized employers. So we don't have time to go through the whole thing, but I've given you some slides on key issues then for the new Labor Relations Board activities. So one of the things they've added is a balancing test to the handbook to balance the needs of both employers and employees. It significantly alters the jurisprudence on determining reasonable interpretation of employee handbook rules. The previous instructions are directives from the National Labor Relations Board, which are much more heavily worded towards employees. This is perhaps more neutral from that perspective. It specifically notes that work rules that specifically ban protected concerted action remain unlawful. So it says, okay, we're lightening up on employers and what they have to do, but where there's specificity in the law, we're going to keep that the way it is. And so those activities will remain unlawful. And the application of facially neutral rules against employees engaged in protected concerted action will also remain unlawful. So while many employers have applauded these new rules and its balance, they have to remember that they're still going to be held accountable for things that have previously been decided violate the law. So the new guidance has three categories. The first are rules that are generally lawful to maintain. And some of these things directly are in direct opposition to what the previous Natural Labor Relations Board ruled. So we don't. I have them listed here for those of you who are interested in spending time in 96. I think it would be a good idea. As a matter of fact, if you actually want to get a copy of the new Natural Labor Relations Board rules on employee handbook, just go to the website and you can download the rules. It's a 20-page document. And it will provide you with significant guidance then on what you should consider in your employee handbook. So it's divided, you'll see it's divided into three categories. The first is categories of rules that generally are lawful to maintain, things you can do without liability. And you can see there's E, we can go through I. And so these are rules and that you'll understand that in the past you ran into significant problems. Now the board has said, okay, you can do this activity meeting certain guidelines, but we're going to rule that this is generally something employers can do. The second category, Rule 2, is rules warranting individualized scrutiny. So there's going to be the second category where the rules per se may not be a violation, may not be a problem, but the way you've individualized this to your organization or to specific employees may be. So rules under this category are neither lawful nor unlawful and must be evaluated on a case-by-case basis to determine whether the rule would interfere with the rights guaranteed by the Natural Labor Relations Act. And so these are now things that they're not automatically going to say you can do it or you can't do it. It's going to be individualized. So you're going to get individual employees filing these types of claims. And then the third category are just rules that are unlawful to maintain. So this is based on settled rules and litigation. And so these are rules that are generally unlawful to maintain because they would prohibit or limit the Natural Labor Relations protected activities, have an adverse impact on rights guaranteed by the Natural Labor Relations Act. So if you try to prevent employees from, in a work rule, saying, okay, under wages, we're going to give you wages, but we don't want you talking to other employees about what your wages are, what our benefits are, what the working conditions are, that is a specific violation and will get you in trouble. So good reason to just review this new document to see what you can do and what you can't do. It's one more thing you've got to do in maintaining and communicating a positive employee handbook. So then as we look at the purpose and value of employee handbooks that are changing, we see that traditionally employee handbooks have primarily functioned as a communication tool to provide information to a passive audience, that is, employees. So HR particularly will go to his office, sit there, write this handbook, write these rules, perhaps share it with legal counsel, and then publish this for employees. At the time employees were hired, they got all this other documentation and things they had to sign. One of the things here is employee handbook signed for the employee handbook. And if you have any questions, give me a call. Well, often employees didn't have questions or issues because they didn't read the handbook. And so that's been the way handbooks have been done, but that's changing. So they have also been relegated to HR and legal to describe the work rules and working conditions, and it has been used as a method to comply with law notice requirements. So some of the laws like Title VII, the FMLA, the ADA have had notice requirements that employers are required to post or provide to their employees. And the handbook has been a way of communicating that. So often the employee handbook will have notices of Title VII, the Civil Rights Act. If you have 50 or more employees, it would have the FMLA notice. And so that's the way handbooks were designed to do. And then probably it may include something about wage and hour issues, but very specific and detailed and perhaps somewhat legalistic in what you were communicating. And the handbook, employee handbook success then has been typically measured by HR efficiencies and cost metrics. And what I mean by that is that often they say, okay, how many employees got the handbook? It's 100%. Well, sometimes we don't get 100%. So 99% of the handbook employees got the handbook. So that we met that goal, and we kept the cost down. The cost of production of the handbook was low or met the target. So we were successful. Let's move on to other things. That's been a way of doing handbooks. Unfortunately, the economy, the competition for new top talent, and dynamic changes in the workplace and workforce have increased the strategic value of human capital. As a result, these factors have changed the emphasis of human resource management from expense control and mitigation. So as you think of the income statement that the organizations have to complete, you have sales coming in at the top. From that, you have expenses, and that leaves profitability. And traditionally, human resource issues have been an expense item. So we know that you have sales, so you're subtracting from that sales figure all your expenses, including human resource figures, and that leaves profitability. So the greater the expenses, the lower your profitability. And so that's been the issue. Well, now that's changing then, because we're looking at human resource management from this expense control and risk mitigation activity to now one that looks at asset enhancement and return on investment. So we're talking about employees now, about human resources, not only from an expense item, but how they can increase the value of the organization. How can they return the investment that you're making in them? So as a result, then, organizations increasingly have to do a few things. First of all, they need to expand the diversity of the participants involved in handbook development. So again, when we do an employee handbook, we request a team, not just the human resource manager, but a team that sits down and will go through numerous copies of the handbook to try to develop what are the key issues, what things should be said, sometimes what things should not be said, but keeping it up to date. It's an important part then of the handbook development. Pay greater attention to the expanding number of potential employee stakeholders. As I said, this number is expanding. So not only employees, but perhaps applicants, perhaps independent contractors now who aren't employees but may be subject to some of these issues, need to think about the employee handbook differently. Considers new formats for handbook design and methods of distribution. Well, we've traditionally looked at handbooks as a document, a written document that we print up pages and we hand them that document. Increasingly now, particularly with millennials, we're looking for other forms, particularly web-based or electronic version. And so many handbooks now are first developed in a written form and then translated or communicated electronically. And this is something you should do. I'm not of the opinion you should do away with the written copy, but certainly we should be looking at new methods of communicating, and an electronic version is certainly an important method of doing that. We need to assess and measure the impact of employee handbooks on the employment brand and talent management activities. So as we're developing our handbook, we're now looking at not as this neutral factor, but what impact does it have? Does it help us attract new employees? Does it help us keep new employees? Does it communicate management's requirements? And so this now is something, a way of evaluating the handbooks that perhaps we didn't do in the past. Before we used to say, here's your handbook, don't bother us anymore. Now we're actually looking at the results of what the handbook is achieving. Then we need to assess and measure the handbook's contribution to achieving these business objectives. So these now become important goals and process of employee handbook. So then as a result, our handbook needs to be updated to include new areas. So first question is your handbook an employment contract? So there still are legal issues that we need to communicate for clarity of our relationship with our employees. And the first thing we want to say is this is not a contract. The fact that you've gotten an employee handbook does not mean we have a contractual relationship with you. And that something goes in the first section or pages of the handbook. We want to create that environment that this is not a employment contract. We also want to talk about the employment at will statement. And unless you're in Montana, this is the law for the rest of the country. Matter of fact, perhaps in the only country in the world that has employment at will, something you need to be aware of. Some of the relationship you want to create with your employees that says, employees, you're employed at will, which means you can leave us at any time for any reason, good, bad, or indifferent, you can leave us. And we can't require you to stay 2 weeks. We can't require you to stay 2 days. We can't even require you to give notice. Now, we may request that and may appreciate that, but we can't do that. But, of course, that also means that we don't have to do that. We don't have to give you 2 weeks' notice. We don't have to give you advance notice. We can separate you at any time for any reason. And the reason can be good, bad, or indifferent. So that's the relationship you want in your employees, and a place to communicate that is in your employee handbook. What limitations do you place on your handbook, and who can make changes to issues discussed in your handbook? And that, again, should be up front in your handbook and say, this is binding on all employees unless the individual employee and the president of the organization or the CEO of the organization have a separate signed agreement. Both parties need to sign that. So something to be attractive, keep aware of. So as we continue with these new issues then, one of the things we're seeing is that while at the federal level, under current administration, we're not getting new laws, if you're from a state perspective and you're on the East Coast and West Coast, new laws are coming frequently. Sometimes it seems like weekly, but certainly annually. So from California to New York and even Maryland now have laws that are being changed and updated, and so your employee handbook used to be basically based only on federal law, now needs to consider state laws. And of course, as the states pass new laws, some of which are different from each other, some of which are the same, you may end up having to create multiple employee handbooks if you're a national organization. So the key issues then you need to consider. Same thing with equal pay, time off issues. These are issues that are specifically developed and designed by state laws rather than what's going at the federal level. Now, they can be, but they're not. Also, we have to look at the individuals we're hiring. We're hiring more millennials now. What does that mean? What are their expectations in the handbook? Key issues like genetic testing. How does that affect things we've included in the handbook? LGBT issues. Similar to millennials, we're now looking at hiring more individuals, and these are issues we have to address for them. Consensual workplace romantic relationships. So we know that sexual harassment is for organizations, key issues for our employees. We need to talk about that. And then cyber breaches. Perhaps we don't fully understand how these are going to change, but to the extent we put our employee handbooks online or our intranet site, got to be aware of that. So key changes then that we're looking at in our employee handbook. And then I'll just mention that in 2016, the Defend Trade Secrets Act was passed. And this law allows businesses to file a lawsuit in federal court to protect their trade secrets from unscrupulous former employees and dishonest business competitors. It should be incorporated in every employment handbook. So you say your contract or agreement with the employee that governs the use of trade secrets or other confidential information should be increasingly discussed in your handbook. So if you don't have this discussed in your handbook now, under work rules or perhaps a separate category, something you need to think about as another development in employee handbooks. You also additionally expand the diversity of participants as we discussed in employee handbook development. You need to pay greater attention to the expanding number of potential stakeholders that have handbooks, and we talked about that. You need to consider new formats and design. And so we talked about that, and the increasing use now of web version handbooks to communicate important information. Additionally, we're going to have to assess and measure the impact of the employee handbook on our employment brand and talent management activities. So perhaps we never looked at the handbooks in that way. It was just something we felt we need to provide, listing of work rules. We never looked at the impact that it could have or does have on our ability to attract and maintain employees. So this is a change now in the analysis that we're doing of all HR management activities, including our employment handbook. We're also looking at how the handbook contributes to achieving business objectives. Again, something organizations never did. But now to the extent that employee handbooks are mentioned in the employee handbook, something now we're looking at, how does the handbook affect our ability to achieve our business and strategic objectives? What can we do differently to increase that impact? Key things now we're looking at from the standpoint of managing our employee handbook. So then the question is, when was the last time your organization updated its employee handbook? And so for many of you, perhaps you've done it last year and you're doing it again this year. Perhaps some of you haven't done it for a few years. Hopefully everyone has a handbook, or you're probably certain at least when it happened. But you need to, particularly if you're on the East and West Coast, you need to look at the changes that are occurring because that may require you to do updated handbook. So one of the things that we did in this area as part of our handbook activity, we did a nationwide survey of employers, and they range in size from employers with fewer than 10 employees to those with more than 200,000 employees. And we found a number of critical issues. I'm going to review some of these critical issues. I'm going to go quickly, so if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them for you afterwards. But what we found is there's a significant disconnect between employee handbooks and the practice of implementing the handbook. What we found is that participants indicated that they used a variety of methods to communicate employment policies. So one, of course, is the handbook was used to communicate this policy, but there are others. Others use memos, others communicated orally, and some have identified already that they communicated electronic. This study is now a couple years old, but begins to give you a fallout of how employers are looking at handbooks to communicate these messages. Then we looked at when developing the policies, what did the employer, what the organization do. So 89% considered their corporate culture and their handbook. 87% looked at the included policies and procedures that was strategic business and talent management, EEO, diversity objectives, and 75% considered external and internal factors that affected their ability, affecting their organization's competitive and ability to generate revenue. Things that are different. That wasn't recently talked about in the employee handbook, never considered. We then look at the specific purposes of why employers said they were issuing handbooks. And of course, the most common reason was to comply with legal and obligations and requirements. Secondly, to communicate important information. Third was to answer routine employee questions. Next was organizational orderliness, to create positive employee relations, to delineate organizations' employment-related prerogatives, and then finally to assist in the hiring and retention. And so there's a significant difference between comply with legal obligation and hiring and retention. That's changing now. The employee handbooks now are being looked at as an important role, at least a role in helping organizations hire and recruit employees. We also then, in our activity, noticed some weaknesses in the handbook. And so some of the weaknesses we identified were that only 42% indicated they assessed the effectiveness in their handbook and meeting the handbook's purpose and objectives. So for those that actually did think about the purpose and objectives, and of course part of the response was they didn't think about that before they did the handbook, but even for those that did, only 42% compared the effect on what their purpose and mission was. This is going to have to change. One, you need to consider this purpose and objective, but now you got to measure it. So one more thing that gets involved with metrics and measuring is now the impact that your employee handbook had. And only 40% discuss written and unwritten policies and practices in their handbook. So as you're doing your handbook, as you're looking at policies and practices, make sure it's complete. Make sure you have all those issues, because otherwise you're producing a handbook that perhaps doesn't have all the issues you need to address. We looked at we then found that there was a potential inconsistency in policy communications. Only 57% indicate the handbook was assessed the handbook to ensure that the handbook was consistent in the commitment and information communicated during the hiring and onboarding process. And this is an issue, as I said earlier, particularly now with hiring millennials, particularly with low unemployment. Your managers and supervisors are looking for ways, once they identify someone they want to come to be employed by your organization, to get the person to agree, to have the person become an employee. And sometimes that emphasis, that commitment, leads to problems. And so can be a key issue you need to address in your handbook. Ensure that all employees receive a copy of the handbook. Only 74% actually did that. And only 78% compared the handbook with statements made on their application form, offer letters, and personnel action form. So this again goes with what I just said. I mean, employers are looking to hire individuals. Once they find someone, they will make statements on their, particularly their offer letters, that are directly contrary to what's in the employee handbook. So you need to coordinate all these documents. So you take your employee handbook and you take your personnel action form, your employment applications, and then your offer letters, and make sure they're consistent. Sometimes that may be difficult, but it's going to save you problems later on. We also found weaknesses that were found in employee logistics and handbook. So only 54% include an issue date on their handbook. Something we recommend, something we do on all our handbooks, is the date it's finally issued. So October 2018. And that should go on every page, from the front cover to the final page, should have the date that the handbook was issued. Should have then revision dates, and only 61% had revision dates. So where you don't change the whole handbook, but where you revise it because the law has changed or your organization has changed something, that should then go on the page with a revision date. And only 63% regularly review to assess their handbook design, format, and method of distribution to determine effectiveness. Well, this is particularly important now with the influx of millennials. Something you need to do. If you haven't done it, you're going to need to do it, and you're going to need to think about the impact of employee handbooks now on the organization. And we found that employee handbooks were often done behind closed doors. Only 55% indicated that managers and supervisors previewed the handbook before it was issued. So again, you're doing something that has a specific implication for managers and supervisors, but only 55% actually showed them the handbook before it was issued. And so in some cases, if things weren't done correctly, it was because they didn't know it was coming. And only 15% had a group of employees do it. As I mentioned earlier, this is an increasingly important issue, particularly with millennials and other new employees coming in. You want to identify those key issues before you put it to writing and find out, yeah, next time I'm going to have to change that. Then we looked at the handbooks on various its impact on other stakeholders. So we looked at the impact of employees, on supervision, on stockholders, investors, which negatively rated employers' handbooks, on insurance carriers. So if you have an employment practice liability insurance product and you have a carrier with that, they're going to request a copy of your handbook. So their input may have impact. 66% on EEOC and DOL, government agencies, and only 54% when the handbook was displayed or used in trial with juries and courts. So of course, that's better than the opposition, but 54% is not a great record for supporting your case in a lawsuit. So something else to consider. Then we looked at once the handbook was issued, we saw organizations. It's okay. We've done that. Let's move on to other things, and that's exactly what they did. Only 64% ensured that the handbook were recognized and responded to changes in the organizational structure, location, and operations. And again, this is increasingly important as organizations now go into new states or additional states and have very significant differences in state laws. 51% ensured the handbook was responsible to a changing workplace, and only 11% followed up with employees to determine if the handbook actually answered their questions. So most employers then give out the handbook and never then say to employees at some point in time, what was your reaction to the handbook? Did it answer your questions? What else can we provide you? Maybe that's after the fact, but at least it's some analysis of how well you're doing. And the vast majority of employers don't do that. Handbooks were written for the moment, so only 47% indicated they consider future and organizational needs and emerging employment issues when drafting a handbook. So they're doing the handbook, and they say, okay, what are our current needs? But needs now are changing much more quickly. And so by the time they go through this process and finally get the handbook out, things may change. So you need to think about handbooks now in a different perspective than what is the current issues, but what are perhaps the current issues we have to be aware of. And then we looked at the various issues that were included in the handbook. So we have a sexual harassment statement, EEO statement, a statement of policy, drug-free workplace policy, an employment at will policy, a statement handbook is not a contract. So these are the common front page issues then for handbooks. And you can see most employers then included these issues. Then we had issues like statement concerning the organization's use of the organization's electronic equipment, discussion of wage and hour issues, an FMLA policy, complaint procedure, and a statement concerning the organization's use of property. So again, key issues then that employers are addressing currently in their handbook. Then we move down to perhaps the next set of issues that are being discussed, code of ethics, discussion of the organization's history, mission, and culture and values, only 81%. And I would recommend that go in every handbook. That you start off in the handbook by saying, this is who we are. This is the key issue. This is something that senior management can write, the president can write, in his or her own terms, in his or her own style. It can be different than other handbooks. This is what's welcoming. Many employees, while they're waiting to talk to their manager, will read these comments. So an important issue then that we think should be included in the handbook. Statement of confidentiality of information, statement of organization's employee relations, and then a surprising response was a listing of offenses that would subject the employee to disciplinary action, only 70%. So more than a quarter of the employers weren't saying anything about disciplinary action, places that the employee could be discharged or perhaps disciplined. Again, every employer should have some listing of work rules that affect the employees and can